you've been thinking about work and total work. So perhaps we should start off with a short, or however long you want to talk about it, a description or a summary of what total work is and what you mean by that.
Oh, sure. My friend Paul Millard put it this way when he was describing my view. He said that for Andrew, total work means almost everything is work. So I would just revise that by saying that almost everything is work, and work is almost everything to us. That might be a pithy formulation. Yeah. I can unpack it by saying that total work could be defined as the process by which human beings, over a long enough period of time, and through a number of iterations, are transformed into capital W workers, and nothing else, as more and more aspects of life are transformed into work, or into being work-like. So one way of thinking about that is not to say this is an economic analysis, and that's what Pieper was trying to suggest, nor was he trying to suggest that it is a sociological analysis. It's a metaphysical inquiry into what a human being is in modernity. And a human being, I would say, is come to stand in the world in the guise of a worker, in the guise of one who is a doer, to use some Hindu language for a moment, a capital W, a capital D doer, that is being instantiated in the specific form of the worker. And then what's interesting about this thesis, this definition, is that it allows you to begin to understand a number of seemingly disparate developments and phenomena in the world, a number of different discourses, a number of different concerns people have, ambitions, goals, projects, and so on.
Yeah. When you say metaphysical worker, does that mean that everything that we do basically has to have, or necessarily has, always already, to speak metaphysically, always already a certain economic value to it? Or how, so anything we do, even if it's just cooking at home, that's considered work? Or how should we make sense of that notion of a metaphysical worker?
It certainly means that we've laid an economic vocabulary over many things that we do.
Yeah.
For example, there are a number of feminists who have been concerned with women getting paid for their labor at home. I happen to think that's a mistake, but it's not a mistake to think about forms of equality, but it is a mistake, I think, to already presuppose that total work is true, and then to manifest that view in the form of getting paid for cooking, for example.
Yes.
So that's one way in which it reveals itself in terms of our economic vocabulary that's just saturating our lives. So when I speak with people and we philosophize and they have a background, let's say in finance, they'll say, I'm trying to optimize for, or I'm trying to solve for this, right? And they're trying to solve for happiness. So you imagine the idiom, they're solving for happiness, or they're optimizing for flourishing. It's a strange enjambment of different vocabularies.
Okay. Solving for happiness is, so they labor under, so flourishing, eudaimonia, we can get into all of this, is so even when they want to, or would like to be outside of work, even there, they still use the same vocabulary and are within the same dimension of work.
That's why in some of my interviews, such as on Big Think, I point to some of our vocabulary. We might speak of working out, or we might speak of working on relationships. You might think these are trivial examples, but it's surprising to me.
Yeah,
it's surprising to me how much the term has colonized other aspects of our lives, and specifically with how we think and orient ourselves in these different domains.
I think, honestly, language is never trivial. Sure. It's all in how we speak. And what I've noticed over the years, and I'm not speaking even in my mother tongue at the moment, but people are always busy. right? That's the first thing. Everyone's always busy, and even in German, people would now say "Ich bin busy," I am busy, so they use the English word. And but also to, you mentioned working out, and when you think of relaxing or relaxation, it's I think it comes from, if I'm not, the German word would be entspannen. So that means to take off the yoke, to take the yoke off from the bulls that pull the plow through the fields, right? So that verb comes from one of the worst kinds of work an animal could perform. And relaxation, I'm not sure about the etymology here, but it sounds like something, you're always tense, and then you have to relax for a bit, right, so you can be tense again.
That's also, we should give some more credit to Pieper, because he suggests that one of the properties of the worker is this effortfulness, right? And so and what I've tried to add to the conversation is the proposal that the total work vocabulary has also led to derivative terms that are understood in the light of total work. For example, it becomes almost impossible for us to think about stillness. I'm going to try to find a different word here, right? Stillness or contemplation, I think, is still a pretty good word here. To think about contemplation as not being understood as that which is an instrumental tool for the sake of doing more work. So we think instead of relaxing, that is, we've already tensed ourselves effortfully for a long enough period of time that we will indulge. We will indulge in a certain kind of idleness, of relaxation for a bit. Perhaps it will be on the clock, and surely it will be a form of hedonic pleasure, all with the goal of restoring ourselves so we can throw ourselves into more productive activities.
Yeah. When you mentioned you speak to people, for example, in finance, who are always effortful, or seem to be always effortful, and want to optimize every little aspect of their existence. How, just to look, comment from the practical, from your work, how, first of all, maybe just how do you respond to them, and how does something change within how they see, or can they change, and what happens if they do? Can they still be a worker in these high performance, high pressure jobs, for example, just out of interest?
No, this is going to be a lengthy multiple part response.
Take all the time you need. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll be here until tomorrow morning. I'm just teasing.
Your morning or my morning?
Probably my morning. I think it's going to be your noontime or something like that. Well, you mentioned in passing this might be considered my work, and that's, I think, a big question. That is, what is it that I'm up to when I am conversing with someone? I think we could split hairs here, but I would call that contemplation, or contemplating with others, or philosophizing. And I would say it's actually a leisurely activity. If someone says you're getting paid for that, it would take me a while to explain that actually it's a different economic model, which is a gift economy. And there are reasons that came up with that model here. Yeah. So that's the first fairly important point. I wouldn't say that I'm actually involved in an effortful task with someone. I'm actually involved with contemplating the basic matters with that person. Now, as to what happens with that person, it might help to also know that the people I speak with would be what I call weird, switched on people. That is to say, it's set aside your ideal type of a person in finance and instead go with someone who is a little bit strange. That person happens, for example, to be in finance, but he or she is already a bit on the outskirts of finance, or that person's involved in tech and happens to be a CEO, but he's also going to Peru to do ayahuasca. Or, I mean, I'm getting some pretty groovy people. It's important to know that I'm probably not going to be philosophizing with someone who hasn't had his or her life opened up to these basic matters. Yeah. So that's the second part. I'm already getting a subset of the world population that's a little more attuned, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then as for the practical question, I'll give you an example from earlier today. There is a man who was speaking to me about his anxiety concerning always being productive. And he came always wanting to be productive in one capacity or another. And he had this epiphany, he said, that's his word, not mine. And the epiphany was that his role as a father was actually more important than his role as a productive person. So that's not a bad start. So you can begin there. And but then he described his role as being a job. He said, my biggest job is raising my children well. So he has this strange Aristotelian vocabulary that's being woven in together with this economic vocabulary.
Yeah.
So the first thing I might ask is it really the case? Since we're philosophizing here, I can ask, is that really the case? It's a job. And he'd doubtless say, no, it's not a job, it's responsibility. And then we can do some conceptual analysis on the difference between responsibilities and jobs. But suppose we even understand that. And he says, now I think that being productive is less important, but let's say, than being a good father, right? Raising my children well.
Yeah.
Still, it's the case that we can ask, why is it that productivity is so important for you? Now, he's going to say, he didn't say this, but he's going to say something like as follows. Well, being productive is important for me because it brings about flow states, or it's important to be able to be effective or to get a lot done in a short period of time.
Yeah.
But you can look at that a little more closely and say that there might be other notions about what it is. I'm fairly Taoist in nature. What it is to go along with things as they're going along and to be in tune with life as it's going along. That's a certain kind of experience that we can describe and thicken. But what's happened is that productivity, especially in the United States, but no doubt also in Germany and other developed countries, has come to seem as though it's this very important term. It's either a fundamental feature of the good life, right? It's a constitutive part of the good life, or it's a fundamental means by which one lives a good life. And so that's something that a philosopher can quite clearly bring into practice. Now, I only gave you one question. You could imagine this inquiry going on for a while to a point at which there's a realization. And the realization is that obviously he's a product of historical and cultural and social conditioning. And he's beginning to realize that there's probably a genuine ideal here that can be separated out from the economic discourse that he's inherited. Yeah. So I'm not, to the person who says I'm teaching someone to be, in good Protestant language, a lazy hippie. That's not really what I'm up to, though I think a little bit more of the hippiness would be fantastic. What I am doing is teaching someone to become, at least initially, to use Hindu language, a witness, right? A witness to the vocabularies that are operating without getting wrapped up in those languages, those discourses. It's possible, and Richard Rorty has a term called the ironist, which he put forward in his book, Contingency, Irony, Solidarity, which is of the form that you can actually take part in a vocabulary or a discourse without yourself being, now I'm using Buddhist language, wrapped up in and attached to that discourse. That's at least a first step, right? The first step in meditation is to begin to realize that you are not identical with your thoughts. The first step in philosophy, you might say, is to peel yourself back from a discourse that you've been seduced by and you've been asleep in. Yeah.
Heidegger would say, I guess, to free yourself or oneself, well, not oneself, but we are always already, for Heidegger, inauthentic in the everyday, necessarily. And he speaks of the dictatorship of the they. You read what they read. This is a generalized, anonymous mass that we each individually are to a certain degree. And one always has to wrest one's authenticity from inauthenticity. You're never fully authentic. One is always both, right? To be or to exist always means to be inauthentic as well as authentic, but one can begin to realize in how what it is that language does there, that it begins, you push yourself away from that. For Heidegger, by the way, death is extremely important in this regard. Facing up to or running forth towards death as the impossibility of existence. And I find it always striking that death, mortality, etc., is entirely ignored in these high performance environments.
But that's right. Life is not the contrary of death. Work is the contrary of death.
Yeah, but work has to go on. Do you find that in also in your thinking about this and in your contemplating this phenomenon, that there's a certain circularity to it? So that when people say, I need to optimize whatever, right? I need to optimize my happiness, I need to optimize my productivity, I need to optimize my cooking, whatever it is, we need to optimize everything. The reason for this is so that something gets better, or that I get better.
That's right.
And then you ask, well, what? That's, why do you want to get better? Well, because I want to get better.
Right.
So you optimize for the sake of optimization, and you right. So it circles around itself.
Right. They've adopted the economic concept of growth, indefinite growth, and this is what tends to happen. Their philosophies of life are like applied economics, just as economic growth is indefinite in nature. And if you ask, why do you want to grow? The answer is, we want to keep growing. So they would say, why do you want to be involved in personal growth or personal improvement or self-improvement? And the answer is, I want to be involved in more personal growth or self-improvement. Yeah. It's a non-telic answer, right?
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
Okay, so let me leap in. You said non-telic, so there's no telos.
Yes, that's right.
There's no purpose.
Right.
Almost no meaning to it.
Yeah.
It's nihilistically circling around itself.
Sure. Yeah.
And maybe what I've been thinking maybe as well is that there's need to accelerate and speed up and not take a break. I mean, not contemplate, shall we say. People are taking breaks, yeah. But is precisely because then all of a sudden it might light up, show itself that what we're doing is deeply nihilistic.
Certainly. I think that I'll give you another example. A man who's involved in venture capital in New York City speaks with me about a year and a half ago about total work.
Yeah.
He goes off on a hike with his fiance. They're lovingly and involved with that beautiful hike. And then he comes to a panic attack and he's rushed to the hospital, not knowing at the time that it was a panic attack.
Yeah.
Now we've since examined what happened, but that's a great example, right? He stopped. So you can extrapolate from this if you want to and say that existential anxiety of a deep kind is, so to speak, just beneath the surface for many people.
Yeah.
It's surprising to me how few people actually can probably sit, close their eyes, and meditate for 10 minutes or so. And I think that it's a very hard thing for people to do, just because they don't really know how to stop. It's insanity. It's really quite shocking how thoughtless it is. As Hannah Arendt said, this is a form of incredible cultural thoughtlessness.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that it's right beneath the surface.
Certainly.
This neurosis, this incapacity to stand still, then is a constant running, a fleeing from. You said it's thoughtlessness, and one could say it's a fleeing from thinking.
Sure.
And
I'm happy with all those formulations. In a recent podcast, I call it a form of double forgetting.
Yeah.
We forget, right? We forget, and then we forget that we forget. Right. So we forgot to think, or whatever else it was. We forgot to examine the fact that we're going to die.
Yeah.
And the agent has nothing to say in the face of its own non-agentality.
Yeah.
And then we forgot that we forgot, right? There's a deep cultural forgetfulness at a second order level. It's hard. One thing I think we should be careful about here, though, is that there's a certain kind of we need to go within this view. We need to inhabit it.
Yeah.
I think it's very unwise to be philosophers who are simply looking from beyond it and think that it's silly. And I'm not saying that either of us is saying that, but that's a temptation. The temptation is to throw darts. And when I'm conversing with someone, I'm beginning with where that person is, right? As Nirvana says, "Come as you are." So the person's coming as he or she is, and then that's my starting point. And I'm trying to move with as few preconceptions and prejudgments as possible in an organic fashion to a point which that person's able to see something that has been illuminated. I think that's my way of thinking about philosophy. It's very easy to formulate external critiques, and that's what I was pretty good at in graduate school. but here we're actually thinking about the first factor that we're missing, or we haven't yet discussed, is that people are actually suffering. They're actually quite miserable. It's not the case that total work is such as to give rise to happiness or eudaimonia or living and faring well, or fulfillment. Quite the contrary. It's an incredibly miserable existence, whether someone is successful or whether someone is not successful. So this, the starting point is actually, I'm a Buddhist. The starting point is actually trying to bring about the kinds of insight that will, at least through philosophical understanding, diminish unnecessary human suffering, individually first, but then also collectively.
Suffering is another aspect, not maybe an aspect, but another phenomenon we're not supposed to experience. It's not allowed to be. Similar as death, we take pills, as you know, to maintain or keep up productivity. Funny enough, though, if by denying suffering and pain, one has to take pills that numb pain for a certain amount of time, but that leads to a different pain. Pain and suffering never fully go away. This is something that's very striking, but disregarding negativity or nothingness only makes it seems more powerful, and it comes back in different forms. So you may feel happy during or productive during the day, but you might be terribly voided on the weekend or in the evenings, or have night terrors. And
that's right. There's a man, just to provide some evidence to what you're saying. There's a man I speak with living in Los Angeles who is an entrepreneur. He's about my age, so he's almost 40. He's starting to do well in his entrepreneurial ventures, or doing better than he had done. He comes home, however, to an empty apartment or an empty home. He's come to realize that he's lonely. And there's no way around. There's no knockdown way of avoiding that. There are ways of turning away, of betraying your sense of your actual understanding of loneliness. But and they're often subtle. So I give you that's a pretty easy example to think about the fact that suffering is suffusing, it's permeating toward work. But the harder ones to look at are the ways in which we ordinarily turn away from our own suffering. You have a conversation with someone, that person says something that implies suffering, and you pass over it. You're polite, you're cordial, or you're a little ill at ease, so you pass by. Or that person says, "Yeah, but it's going to be fine." Or you say, "Don't worry about it, things are going to get better." There's some kind of there's some kind of positive spin put on it.
Yeah.
And we do this to ourselves. If the Buddha's right, then we just pretty much dwell every day and turning away from our own suffering over and over again, usually through second order intellectual strategies. And so what we're getting at here is that what's particularly peculiar, uncanny about the total work dispensation is that it requires not just the effort involved in working in a first order way, but also the, let's call it mental work, and maybe I mean that here, the mental work involved in continuing to turn away from death, as you pointed out, from suffering. But let's not use suffering here in the sense of someone who's really in a bad way. I mean suffering in the sense of someone who just feels off, who feels ill at ease, who feels a moment, a moment of something that is the hint of dissatisfaction. All of these things keep being turned away from. It's like Peter betraying Jesus. It just keeps happening over and over again, right? It's amazing that there's so much we have to do. There's so much machinery involved in keeping this up.
Yes. Speaking of suffering, because you mentioned how to understand suffering, as you know, Nietzsche has this notion of amor fati. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't have to worry about Nietzsche too much, but the way it's sometimes, I think, maybe misunderstood is that, yes, there can be an extremely terrible situation. Would Nietzsche then say, this is really necessary? I think what Nietzsche and other thinkers mean here is more something like, by existence, it's by existing, simply by existing, you suffer. Mm-hmm. And as you know, coming from Buddhism, that's fundamental, one of the truths of Buddhism, and you can say more to that than me, but this ignorance of accepting that existence itself isn't a promise of material happiness, but always already entails, necessarily is suffering also, not only, but as well, is by completely ignoring that. I think that we're not just making it, as you say, these weird situations where, oh no, don't worry, it'll be fine, or we joke about it, etc. But it's also on some level, you take away a deeper level way of experiencing of what it means to be human. Right. It's always already covered over. It needs to remain on the surface. Right. The superficial happiness, etc.
Mm-hmm. This is why I've been trying to rethink or come back to the contemplative traditions. My view is that I have a kind of Taoist view, which I think is probably somewhat in accordance with a Heideggerian view. I don't know Heidegger nearly as well as you do, I'm sure. But I take the fundamental premise is that life is mystery.
Yeah.
So we'll start there. I'm thrown into, or I arrive in a very mysterious world.
Yeah.
And then not only is life writ large a mystery, one that seems almost unfathomable, it's also the case that when I actually pay attention to my own experience, it is suffering. It's unsatisfactory as it is. I like to put it recently, I said it's as though my experience is laced with suffering. It doesn't mean that everything about an experience, an egoic experience, is bad.
Yeah.
That would be a really trivial and false view. It's that there's something that's a little bit turned about it. And now if you take those starting points, that life is mysterious, and that my own experience of the world, insofar as I actually pay attention to it, is laced with suffering, then you end up very organically generating contemplation. Well, what is this mystery that I've come into? And so you end up generating questions, right? You end up the questions arise for you, and you take them up.
Yeah.
And you have every reason to do so, because if life is mysterious, then it's already yearning to be understood, or yearning to be engaged with. And if your life is laced with suffering, then you have sufficient motivating force to begin to inquire into, why is my life suffering? In what sense is it suffering? How did it happen? And of course, these are not just existential questions, there are also political questions and historical questions and the like.
Yeah.
This is all the life is mystery, and life writ large is mystery, and my life is suffering are being foreclosed by total works. So I see my responsibility as a public philosopher in this regard to try to provoke and incite the kinds of questioning that's just around the corner.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm up to. It's a bit like, it's the gadfly, right? It's certainly that. When I'm speaking with someone else, I call that contemplative philosophy. I'm actually trying to get someone to apprehend how wonderfully mysterious life is.
Yes.
That's not going to come through every question, but through a kind of incantation of sorts. I think philosophy has a certain magical quality, if I may put it that way, more or less.
Yeah.
But the public philosophy is instead an attempt to get beneath people's skin. It's more confrontational. Right? It's a little more gently aggressive.
Yeah.
Right. In the hope that it will incite.
Like Diogenes.
Yeah, a little bit like that. Yeah.
On the market square.
Right. right. Yeah. That's right.
What you just said is, just to briefly say, yes, Heidegger says, well, we are lacking, and he says this very early on in 1929, to my knowledge, for the first time publicly in a lecture course. He says, what we lack in our existence today is Geheimnis, is mystery. Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, the word Geheimnis can mean secret and mystery in English, but in the German also has the root of the word is Heim, which means home. The Geheimnis is the gathering of being at home. Mm-hmm. Without a mystery, we are for Heidegger, in homelessness. We are homeless. We're nomads. We can never return home. Mm-hmm. One of the things that philosophy reminds us of, Master Eckhart says, there's a Catholic mystic. He has a dialogue, and one of the interlocutors asks, "Why do you go out?" "To return home." Mm-hmm. Right. And what you said about work, something that for some reason lighted up this notion of, we talked about leisure activities before, and how they can be extremely industrialized as well. Right. On the one hand, very often our leisure activities are not creative. They're not self-initiated. They are entertainment. They're forms of consumption. There's the cinema. I would even say the museum. Something where you just go because one has to go. Again, the dictatorship of the day, etc. But even there's a certain character of one is at work. We go hiking, we have to take pictures. And one of the examples I keep using in my talks and sometimes also online is people are now queuing up on Mount Everest. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've seen the pictures of that. So the awe, the mystery of that mountain, of that mountain range, and you come to think of the symbolic meaning of mountains for human existence, it's kind of stripped away, right? It's something to tick off. So I just wanted to throw that out there and see what
I can just add a footnote to that. Yeah. Don DeLillo, some years back, beat people to the punch when it comes to Everest. In his book White Noise, he has a scene, if I recall correctly, in which people are going to this barn, and it might be in Pennsylvania. So they're just queuing up to go to this barn because it's so quite a spectacle. And so he's already pointing at the way in which, let's say, the sublime has become spectacle.
Yes. Sublime is. I mean, what I because I mean the sort of the danger, to me at least, in anything that we're trying to say, is always that one could just take, oh, let's just add some more mystery,
Mhm.
right? It's an optimized for mystery,
Sure.
or optimized for the sublime or so. And I think, though, do you see that danger as well, that this is something that could happen, or is it not as absolute as this system, if you like, appears or wants to be? That there are exits, escapes, ways of opening up other realms of being, if I may be so poetic.
Sure. No, I think I like the poetry. I like to say that while this is not always true, it's often enough true. Often enough true. Someone comes to philosophy when that person's been knocked off his horse.
Yeah.
So that's it. Doesn't mean that that person's incapable of functioning in the world, but somehow he or she has been knocked off the horse.
Yeah.
And that's the condition of possibility for later on the apprehension of mystery.
Uh-huh.
Or let's take a different example.
Yeah.
Michael Pollan recently wrote a book called How to Change Your Mind, which is about psychedelics. I like this. I'm a psychedelic version. I can say that on YouTube here.
Yeah.
But what I like about this development is that he's a secular humanist avant la lettre. He's a pretty standard skeptical journalist.
Yeah.
And he's starting to look at psychedelics. And I'm not necessarily arguing in favor of psychedelics. I'm not arguing against them. What I'm saying instead is that it's a nice intimation of what people feel is missing.
Yeah.
They feel that there's something missing with regard to a non-ordinary, non-egoic experience. Now, some people are doing it for the sake of therapy or healing, but I'm talking about a different set of people who are concerned with the mystical. You mentioned Meister Eckhart, the Christian mystic. So I'm not deconstructive enough to think that, I think, if I may joke, what the deconstructionists missed was the existence and the possibility of psychedelics, right? That's what they missed. I mean to say, the claim that there is no exit to some kind of paradigm or system is missing something. It's not social constructionism all the way down. It's not turtles all the way down, turtles all the way up.
Yeah.
There are actually points, and that's why I began in my pedestrian example by saying someone's going along just fine in life, and that person gets knocked off his horse. It doesn't have to be an amazing event that does this. It doesn't have to be the death of a family member or anything, or a civil war in Syria. No, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. Instead, it could be something as pedestrian as losing one's keys, to take a very trivial example that probably isn't a very helpful one. There's something that shakes, or rattles you beyond what you would have anticipated. You lose control. You can't make sense of it, and there's a sense in which you're not quite sure if you still have it all together. You're not just that your world is unraveled, but you're starting to feel a little bit rattled yourself. And that seems like the beginning, this tremendous quaking is, I call it, in one place I call it convulsive experience. This convulsive experience is the beginning of waking up.
Yeah.
I don't think you can, maybe I'm Americanly optimistic here, but I don't think you can totalize that. That's contingent. You also can't predict it. It just so happens that it keeps happening for people. And there might be conditions such as the moment of climate change we're in right now, or other existential threats that are more conducive to giving rise to people not getting knocked off their horse. But even apart from those, you would still find any number of contingent events that would be sufficient to cause a swerve.
Yeah.
Or to cause the beginning, not yet to go off and become a philosopher, but the beginning, the start of a search.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned the deconstructivists, just maybe as another bit of a jab at them. It's very funny because they don't seem to, I mean, I'm not too familiar with Derrida and all of them, but they don't seem to be too fond of the human being, but at the same time, everything's focused on human construction, right? And then when you say someone gets knocked off the horse, that's to say you're no longer the actor in your life. It's not you who does anything. There's something that just happens to you out of the blue, as you put it, contingently. But then, weirdly enough, there's almost a necessity to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That it just so happened. And then that brings about ways of exiting, because I like to think of it as well as not absolute, as not even wanting to be or wanting to appear as exclusive, but not even that's true, because why could we ask any question if it were absolute, or in that sense exclusive or exclusionary? I think asking questions is possible precisely because there's always already some other bubble of possibilities lurking somewhere, and then we can sort of bring that about by asking something. And what I always try or like to bring it back to is Plato's cave, right? Even the cave has an exit,
Mm-hmm.
and of course a necessary return as well. And I think something you said before about what philosophers shouldn't do, or a thinker shouldn't do, is to become ironically distant to others and say, "Oh, look at them, look at the herd, hurling away or slaving away. Haha! I see through all of this, and I'm much better." I think in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, there's a chapter. I think in English it's on passing by or on moving on. And there's someone at the city walls who sounds a bit like Zarathustra, but he's actually the ape of Zarathustra, a copycat of him, and he's extremely full of spite, cynical, full of almost hatred for the people in the city. And Zarathustra then at the end of the dialogue they have tells him, look, if you can no longer love the city or the people in it, you have to move on. Don't get focused on it, because it becomes very destructive and I think full of resentment, right? I think that if anything, you said the public philosopher has to be a bit more punchy and point people to something. That's exactly it, but in a kind, loving way still, because there's a worry, there's care,
that's right,
concern.
Certainly, yeah. I find myself to be very fond of the late Fred Rogers. Not because he was a public philosopher, but because his life is grounded in I think a very beautiful ethic, a very beautiful understanding of the gospel. When when a wiseacre comes to Jesus and asks, give me the Cliff Notes version of the gospel, Jesus famously says, love God and love thy neighbor as thyself. Set aside the loving God for the time being. The loving thy neighbor, and then people like Emmanuel Levinas, in some respects, will riff on loving thy neighbor as thyself, or what he calls responsibility for the other. I think that Fred Rogers is really an amazingly good example, so far as I know, of someone who lived his life according to an ethic of love. He really did begin from love or care or concern. The Buddhists will call it karunya or compassion. And his actions and his words were flowing from that love. Now, sometimes people think of love as being, or compassion as being this fluffy, overly romanticized thing, but it doesn't have to be. And there are many situations in which what's the word I want here? I use provocation, but some pushing is done for the sake, out of loving someone and for the sake of that person's well-being. When I philosophize with someone, I'm not just, oh, that's very interesting. It's not just, I'm not just sitting there. I'm really towing the line between pushing too hard and not pushing enough. But not because I need to see that person go somewhere, but because that person's in a situation where he or she is suffering.
Yeah.
And I'm using that word suffering in the sense of things are being unsatisfactory. Things are somehow unsatisfactory. So I would be abdicating my responsibility if out of love or concern for that person, I was complacent and I let the cards fall where they might. So you're right. I think the great danger is a certain misanthropy. And I've certainly flirted with that myself at various points. You see what Elizabeth Kolbert calls human beings as a weedy species. And you can very readily begin to look from the outside as the mimic of Zarathustra did, with resentment, cynicism, bile, spleen, and animosity in your heart. And you can say, oh, these, for example, these fools of total work, can they not see that modernity is shot through by the ethos of the worker? Can they not see that their ambitions and desires for success and machinations are all for naught? That's self-righteousness, right? And I should add, the really beautiful thing about a number of these religious or spiritual traditions is that they actually do have a place for proper introspection. For Nisargadatta, who was a Advaita Vedanta teacher in the 20th century, the thought was that introspection really begins and ends with the question, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
And I won't take the listener here through an exposition of Nisargadatta's teachings, but that alone gives us a sense that when you begin with the question, who am I?
Yeah.
You can't abdicate your responsibility for the fact that the things that you say may be true, but they may be coming from the wrong place.
Yeah.
That is, even if you mimicked Zarathustra and cloned him very well, and he said everything that the real Zarathustra said, but he did so out of spleen and bile and resentment.
Yeah.
Something would still be deeply, deeply amiss there.
I mean, I guess one should not ask a philosopher for a solution, but where do you see it going currently? Because so if Pieper comes up with this term in the 1950s, and now it's 70 years on, so I would, the way I understand what total work is, and also coming a bit from Ernst Jünger, it's a response to nihilism. Mm-hmm. It is a response to the sensation that there is no meaning and purpose, which are two different things to a certain degree, to life. So there's, the attempt to numb it, to first of all to give ourselves meaning by working a lot, by becoming total workers.
We've come up with a neologism, which is meaningful work, and one way to see the ideology operating is by seeing the proliferation of zazzy words, right?
Yeah.
Zazzy, I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but think about all the the conceptual inventions: meaningful work, social impactful work, purpose-driven work, high impact work. I can go on here, but there's a lot. There's the vocabulary, the words are escalating at the same time that nihilism itself is on the rise. So that's right.
Yeah. One of the things I found striking years ago when I first came to London, I was at some college in somewhere central, and on open day or whatever it was, and businesses would come in, and a lot of these banks and business consulting companies, I don't know what they are. Mm-hmm. I was struck by the existential language that they used. Mm-hmm. Right. Be more than you expected. Right. Be authentic. All of these, words that, the weird thing about language is that when we say certain words, like amazement or faith, they do something to us, right? all of a sudden there's a certain sensation just by saying a word like, philosophy is to bring about a sense of wonder.
Sure.
I mean, to anyone who can still hear, right, who doesn't just have ears as sort of receptacles of receivers of sound waves, but maybe a bit more, then we can still hear. And I think everyone who understands his mother tongue or English would agree that there is something that happens when we say these words for reasons that we don't. To my mind, we don't invent language, but language speaks us. It's bigger than us. It comes before us. But what the ideology, as you put it, or I would say the system does is it takes these words and voids them, but draws people in by promising fulfillment. And now, of course, as you might be aware, now it's purpose, right? Work now is purpose. It's the purpose of your existence is to work.
Right.
So
I'm with you. You're getting to, I think you're about to get to the matter about what sorts of solutions there are.
Yeah, I'm on the one hand, I wonder where, how much further can this go? Where do you see it going, even just in your own thinking, where it could go? And what's the response to it? Two questions.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that it can go too much further. So it can't go. So long as we're thinking about it in terms of possible future scenarios. Here's one, and I'm putting this one forward in a speculative manner. I don't think it's necessarily going to come to pass. Let's suppose that narrow artificial intelligence were so good at completing the run-of-the-mill physical and mental tasks.
Yeah.
And let's suppose that deep or machine learning were so good that it allowed for narrow artificial intelligence to keep learning at a pace that vastly outstripped human capacities. Then it could follow on this speculation that a broad swath of human beings, as Yuval Harari would say, would come to make up a, quote, useless class. By that, he means that they would no longer be employable.
Yeah.
He does not mean they wouldn't be employed. He means that they wouldn't be employable.
Yeah.
So human beings en masse as workers become obsolete. I don't mean that everyone becomes obsolete. I mean, as a mass phenomenon, gainful employment ceases to be the model of livelihood that it has been since the 19th century and up through the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, if that were to happen, it would be good for my thesis, in that you still could have total work, but in a machine form, right? I don't think that total work as a Geist of sorts really requires human beings to keep going on. My view is that it just wants to see itself narcissistically manifested in all corners of the world. That's my interesting thesis.
Yeah.
So that's the first part. But I think for human beings, it would create what I call an existential conundrum. And I think it's already begun doing that in cases in the Midwestern part of the United States, where you have an opioid crisis that hasn't really been properly discussed.
Yeah.
I think white, middle-aged, former manufacturing human beings, i.e. workers, are not facing up to what it is I think they've lost. So that's just one scenario. And according to that one science fiction scenario, history would already move in a direction that would reveal the existential conundrum to our faces. Andrew Yang, who's a long shot American presidential candidate, thinks this is going to happen. I'm not persuaded that necessarily is. You can read more pieces of literature on AI and machine learning and find that there are alternative scenarios. But what I like about it from a philosophical point of view is that it does create this collective stirring. It cannot not be something that some people would face up to. And I think it would be horrifying and horrible, but it would reveal that total work doesn't require us. And
Yeah,
that's not that hard to see because we know that a number.
right. I like that.
Yeah. It's not that hard to see because we already have people who are retired human beings and feel as if they're irrelevant or obsolete. So this is just generating that conundrum as a mass phenomenon.
Yes, and it sounded like that, considering this would come to happen or occur in this fashion or similarly, it would burst open. And we've talked about surface before, right? It's right beneath the surface. There's something lurking, something dark, something uncanny, something that we've all, don't worry, just check on, it's just all good, busy and happy. But once this, you said total work is not human, right? It's something that acts almost acts. It sounds like acts through us, and we enact it. We are its functionaries.
Right.
We have tremendous powers now, right? We can do this. We have a conversation across thousands of miles. We can take airplanes, etc. But it's actually not us really doing it at will. It's something working through us. And once this system no longer, or this thing or whatever it is, no longer needs us, what we've been trying to cover over for decades now, or maybe even centuries, which you could say is, the death of God, the advent of total nihilism, would burst open and be, you said, a conundrum. I would say hell.
I was trying to find some term. Conundrum might be a little bit too, ho-hum. Yes, it would be. It really would be something.
Yeah, and it's one of the phenomena I'm interested in is boredom. And I find it striking. Heidegger has a long lecture course on boredom, and he says that boredom is the fundamental attunement mood, you could say, of our epoch. Is that we are always already bored. He says in a text that's a bit esoteric, Contributions to Philosophy, he says that all of this, what's going on, and we could call this for now total work, whatever it is that's doing, which is for him not human, seems to want to end up in a state of total boredom. And Immanuel Kant, who was, I think the Immanuel Kant who is taught in philosophy departments is very far off from what Kant is after. I think Kant is a very, very, almost extremely dangerous thinker, first of all, but also had a lot to say about existence that is not picked up on. In the Anthropology, Kant says that boredom is horror vacui, is the horror of, the sheer horror of emptiness, of a vacuum. And then a couple of decades later, maybe 30, 40 years, I don't know, Hegel, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, in the introduction, I think, says that there's a certain silliness and boredom that are now beginning to rise. And then Heidegger, 100 years after that, says, boredom is the fundamental attunement. And if you think of it not as, theory and blah, 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 but they're just responding to something that's occurring in modernity, that's coming up, then we haven't, because boredom, Langeweile in the German means like a long dwelling. So it used to mean contemplation. But it now feels like emptiness, vacuum. So we need to produce, we need to consume, we need to do more, we need to optimize. Why? Well, because, etc., etc., etc. Once this is no longer, even if this happens, no longer even necessary, this void breaks open and pulls us in. Which
and then we can look at it in a twofold manner. In the first place, we can see it as the void, as lack, as emptiness. In an ordinary sense. Yet in the second place, some people are, so long as we're speculating here, would go through the void and see it actually as fullness. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen monk, says the way of suffering is the way of liberation. And so you might say here, the way of the void is also the way of plenitude. Because the void, so understood, is the last vestige total work or the system. It's the obverse side of it. It's
Yeah.
that which is surrounding. It's the penumbra. But you have to go through that too, right? And once you go through that, you see that that's also an illusion. That's also a mistake. Do you get what I mean? It's so let's take a simpler example.
Yeah.
You've never actually experienced, not you, one has never actually experienced leisure. So when one is not working, one thinks of what I call free time as leisure. One is just has downtime or spare time.
Yeah.
And that is going to be, in many cases, going to give rise to boredom for a number of people. I'm not doing, and what's worse, I don't know what I would do now, nor do I know, above all, what I would do with myself, and perhaps what I would do with my life. And so this boredom is starting to gnaw a bit. But imagine that some individuals actually go into it rather than flee from it.
Yeah.
My suggestion is that, and this is through my own experience, that going through that actually reveals that that's the outer layer, that's the penumbra of total work. On the other side, I'm not saying this is heaven, I just mean it's actually fullness. I like the Bible when it says that there's a peace that surpasses all understanding. There's a peace that surpasses all ordinary conceptual understanding. There is that possibility. On this other side of free time is leisure. There is the horror of the vacuum, but the horror of the vacuum is the mask, I'm suggesting, of plenitude. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think, yeah, I would agree. It lies in affirming what at first appears to be a lack of something. Right. By affirming the nihilism or boredom.
Yeah. Right.
It's overturned or turned on its head from within.
Yeah.
Always from within, never from not abstractly from outside, but you go into it. One has to.
We know that maybe you're sitting on an airplane and you forgot your book, and if you're like me and you have these academic leanings, you never want to be anywhere without a book, right? And so you forgot your book, and it's going to be a 6-hour flight or a 6-hour train ride or something.
Yeah.
And perhaps you even don't have anything to think about. So you have nothing really good to think about either. And so you're bored. But there might actually come a time when you treat it as a meditation. You think, oh, this is what's arising in consciousness. How interesting that this is what's arising in consciousness. And what's curious is that the more you accept and go into it, the more that you're able to embrace it. Words aren't really doing justice to what this is like. The more what happens is that there's something more than acceptance. Mm-hmm. It is like the illumination of wonderment. It is like a sober joy. And that's what's curious. You can probably read accounts of people talking about experiences when they were bored, or it seemed as though it was a pretty bad situation. And so obviously what I'm giving here is I'm showing my mystical credentials, if that isn't clear already. I have strong mystical leanings, and we might need to talk about what that is at some point, perhaps not today.
Yeah.
But that they intimate, they're intimations, I think. They're intimations on the other side of boredom. But those intimations aren't the ones that can be redeemed, embraced, or fulfilled except or until someone's able to pass through the boredom, the ennui, the listlessness, the acedia, or whatever.
Yeah.
So, what's curious about our science fiction experiment is that on the one hand, yes, there would be a great deal of horror were it to be the case that people could no longer be engaged in constant doings in the way that they once had. So their identities would most surely come into question.
Yeah.
On the other hand, some people would realize that it's only in the stillness, only in the revelation of being, only in the something that is just on the other side of, or just beneath, or just surrounding, or always permeating misunderstood boredom, that it becomes possible to actually realize what they were searching for all along without quite knowing it. That's the incredibly amazing thing. They say that people will say, I want happiness, I want peace, I want fulfillment, I want meaning. The very last place you would look, it turns out, is actually the best place to begin.
Yeah, and maybe just what came to me now is that this is, perhaps you agree with this, this is no longer a willful act. So this is not, you cannot will this to happen.
No, this is the possibility that arises when effort completely subsides. Right? Yeah. So if you're Christian, you might call it grace. Uh-huh. In some of these Eastern traditions, it's kind of a gift of sorts.
Yeah.
It's something arises to the one who is now fully receptive and available, right? And you can probably take that back to Heidegger. There is an amazing openness to what is occurring and to what could possibly be occurring, and even to what is not occurring. We shouldn't even beg the question, say it's about happenings. There's an openness to whatever is or is not happening. And in that openness, there is the possibility of, let's call it, transformation or revelation. And this is where it's hard not to come to something like a mystical or religious language.
Yeah. Because
the mystical or religious language does pay heed to those different kinds of verb choices, the welcoming, the being available to, the opening oneself up to, that there is this otherness that is that to which I'm responding and to which I'm beholden. Yeah. It's from which I'm gaining my life. Right? So you might say that on the other side of total work is a post-theistic, rich metaphysics, a metaphysics in which human beings are no longer understood as humanism does. Rather, they're understood as the ones open and available to gratuity,